Dr. Jordan Hayes knelt on the cold pavement, his hands pressing rhythmically against the chest of a young girl who lay motionless before him. The chaos around him was deafening. Sirens wailed in the distance. People shouted frantically, and the headlights from nearby cars illuminated the scene in harsh, flickering bursts. Sweat dripped down his face as he worked tirelessly to save her life. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, his voice strained but steady. "Don't you dare give up on me." He glanced up for a brief moment, searching for help, anything that could make this easier. Two police officers stood just a few feet away, their arms crossed, watching with detached expressions. One of them shifted his weight lazily, while the other smirked at his partner before turning back to Jordan. "You're doing fine there, Doc," Officer Blake said, his tone dripping with condescension. "We wouldn't want to get in the way of all that expertise." Jordan clenched his jaw, forcing himself not to react. He knew what they were implying, that someone like him didn't belong here, that he wasn't capable enough or worthy enough to command respect. But now wasn't the time for anger. It was the time to focus. Still, he couldn't stop himself from trying one more time. "Can you clear the crowd?" he asked, his voice firm despite the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "It's too chaotic. I can't concentrate." Officer Harris chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Let the doctor handle it himself," he said, drawing out the word doctor as if it were a joke. "That's what you signed up for, right?" The words hit Jordan like a punch to the gut, but he swallowed the sting and kept going. His mind flashed back to earlier that evening when he'd been called out of the hospital by the sound of screeching tires and screams. Without hesitation, he had sprinted toward danger, leaving behind the safety of sterile hallways because he knew someone needed him. That relentless drive had carried him through years of doubt, prejudice, and hardship. It wasn't about proving himself, it was about saving lives. As the seconds ticked by, Jordan felt the girl's pulse grow fainter. Every movement of his hands became heavier, each compression a reminder of how fragile life could be. And then, finally she gasped, a weak, ragged breath that sent a wave of relief crashing over him. She was alive. For now. Breathing hard, Jordan looked up again, locking eyes with Officer Blake. There was no mistaking the sneer on the man's face, the subtle curl of his lip that screamed judgment and disdain. In that moment, Jordan understood something, deep in his bones. This wasn't just about him. This was about every black person who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or ignored because of the color of their skin. It wasn't just frustrating, it was dangerous. Before he could dwell on it further, the distant rumble of an engine caught his attention. A sleek black SUV pulled up behind the police cars, its presence commanding even in the chaos. The driver's deck door opened, and a tall, sharply dressed man stepped out. His gaze swept over the scene with quiet authority, lingering briefly on Jordan before moving to the officers. For the first time that night, Jordan felt a flicker of hope. Something about the man's demeanor suggested power, not the kind that came from arrogance, but the kind born of purpose. He straightened slightly, his exhaustion momentarily overshadowed by curiosity. "Who's that?" a paramedic whispered beside him, following Jordan's line of sight. "I don't know," Jordan replied quietly, his voice tinged with both uncertainty and relief. "But I think he might be here for us." The mysterious man approached slowly, his steps deliberate and measured. As he drew closer, Jordan noticed the sharpness of his suit, the confidence in his posture, and, most importantly, the look in his eyes, a mix of determination and recognition. Whatever was coming next, Jordan realized, would change everything, and then, without warning, the world seemed to pause. The noise faded into the background, replaced by a single thought echoing in Jordan's mind. What happens when power shifts unexpectedly? He didn't have an answer yet, but he could feel the storm brewing, and somehow he knew he was ready to face it. Jordan walked into the hospital break room, his shoulders tense after yet another long shift. He reached for a cup of coffee, trying to shake off the exhaustion that clung to him like a second skin. The room was quiet except for Dr. Peterson, a senior surgeon who sat at the table flipping through patient files. "You know," Peterson began without looking up, his tone casual but pointed. It's impressive how far people can go these days with, what do they call it? Affirmative action? Jordan froze mid-pour, the coffee machine gurgling in the background. His grip tightened on the mug as he turned to face Peterson. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with tension. Peterson finally looked up, feigning innocence. "Oh, nothing against you personally, Hayes. You're talented, sure. But let's be honest. How many others in your position got here purely on merit?" The words hit Jordan like a slap. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but years of biting back anger told him it wouldn't matter. Instead, he forced a tight smile and said, "If you'll excuse me, I've got rounds to finish." He left the room quickly, his mind racing. It wasn't just Peterson. It was everyone. Every snide comment, every sideways glance, every assumption that he didn't belong here gnawed at him. By the time he got home, the frustration had simmered into something heavier. Maya was waiting for him in the kitchen when he walked in, her arms crossed over her chest. She could always tell when something was wrong. "Another bad day?" she asked softly, stepping closer. Jordan sighed, dropping his bag onto the counter. "You'd think saving lives would earn some respect," he muttered bitterly. "But no. Today, Peterson implied I only got this job because of affirmative action. Like all my hard work doesn't count." Maya placed a hand on his arm, her expression both sympathetic and firm. "You've earned everything you have," she reminded him. "Don't let them make you forget that. Remember why you started this journey. To save lives, yes, but also to show people like us that we belong in places like that hospital." Her words struck a chord, but they didn't erase the weight pressing down on him. "It's not just about me, Maya," he admitted quietly. "Every time someone doubts me, it feels like they're doubting our whole community. What does that say to kids who look up to me? That even if they work harder than anyone else, they'll still be seen as less?" Maya didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly as if to shield him from the world outside. "You carry so much more than you should," she whispered. "But don't let it break you. Keep showing them who you are. They won't win unless you let them." Later that night, driving home from a late shift, Jordan found himself pulled over by flashing red and blue lights. His heart sank as he recognized Officer Blake behind the wheel of the patrol car, the same officer who had mocked him days earlier. "License and registration," Blake demanded, leaning into the window with an air of superiority. Jordan handed over the documents, keeping his tone polite despite the knot forming in his stomach. "Is there a problem, officer?" Blake glanced at the papers before smirking. "Reckless driving, you were speeding back there." "I was going the speed limit," Jordan replied evenly, though his pulse quickened. Blake ignored him, walking back to his car to run the plates. When he returned, he gestured toward Jordan's vehicle. "Mind if I take a look inside?" Jordan hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. As Blake rummaged through his belongings, tossing items aside with little care, Jordan felt a mix of humiliation and rage bubbling beneath the surface. "Nice ride for a surgeon," Blake sneered, holding up a stethoscope he'd pulled from the back seat. "Didn't think doctors drove Hondas." The comment stung, but Jordan bit his tongue. Arguing wouldn't help. It never did. When Blake finally handed back his license and sent him on his way with a warning, Jordan drove off feeling smaller than ever. The next morning, things only got worse. During a meeting with hospital administrators, Jordan learned that a wealthy donor had withdrawn funding for a critical pediatric wing. The reason? Complaints about diversity quotas undermining the hospital's reputation. "This isn't personal, Dr. Hayes," one of the board members assured him, though their tone suggested otherwise. "We have to consider the donor's concerns." Jordan clenched his fists under the table, struggling to keep his composure. "So what? We sacrifice patient care because someone doesn't like seeing black doctors succeed?" His outburst silenced the room. For a moment he thought maybe he'd gotten through to them, but instead they exchanged uncomfortable glances, dismissing his concerns with vague promises to reassess. By the end of the week, Jordan was beyond frustrated. In another heated meeting, he snapped, slamming his hands on the table. "You're prioritizing money over lives," he shouted, his voice breaking. "How is that acceptable?" No one responded. They simply stared at him, their expressions unreadable. Feeling defeated, Jordan stormed out of the room, knowing full well he might have just ruined his career. That evening, as he sat alone in his living room staring blankly at the wall, his phone buzzed. An unknown number flashed across the screen. Hesitant, he answered. "Dr. Hayes," came a smooth, authoritative voice. "This is Victor Kane. I saw what happened the other night, and I want you to know you won't have to fight this battle alone." Victor's words caught Jordan off guard. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, change was possible. The conference room felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. Jordan sat at the long table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him to hide their trembling. Across from him were hospital administrators, their faces impassive, and law enforcement officials, including officers Blake and Harris, whose smug expressions made Jordan's stomach churn. At the head of the table stood Victor Kane, his presence commanding but calm. "Thank you all for coming," Victor began, his voice steady and authoritative. "We're here today to address serious concerns about systemic racism within this institution. Let's not waste time pretending otherwise." One of the board members cleared her throat nervously. "Mr. Kane, while we appreciate your involvement, these accusations are unfounded. Budget constraints have forced difficult decisions, nothing more." Jordan clenched his jaw, biting back a retort as another administrator chimed in. "And regarding any claims of discrimination against staff or patients, I assure you, there is no evidence to support such allegations." Blake leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "As for us," he said, gesturing between himself and Harris, "we've done nothing wrong. These accusations are baseless." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, but he remained composed. He turned to Jordan, nodding subtly. It was his cue. Taking a deep breath, Jordan stood up, his heart pounding. For years he'd been silenced, dismissed, and belittled. But now, surrounded by those who had wronged him, he found an unexpected strength rising within him. "You think this is about budgets?" he asked, his voice firm despite the tremor threatening. "To break through. This isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's lives. Lives that are lost because people like me aren't given equal opportunities to save them." He reached into his folder and pulled out printed emails, slamming them onto the table. "These emails prove preferential treatment for white doctors, less experienced colleagues promoted over me, resources allocated unfairly, surgeries reassigned. Without explanation. And don't even get me started on how patients of color are treated differently in this hospital." His words spilled out faster now, fueled by years of pent-up frustration. "I've seen it happen again and again. A black child denied timely care because someone decided their case wasn't urgent enough. An elderly woman ignored it until it was too late, all because of the color of their skin." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy. The air. But instead of acknowledgement or remorse, Jordan saw only blank stares and crossed arms. The board members exchanged glances, whispering amongst themselves while Blake smirked faintly. "That's quite a story, Dr. Hayes," one of the administrators finally said, his tone dismissive. "But without concrete evidence?" Before Jordan could respond, Victor stepped forward, cutting off the man mid-sentence. His demeanor shifted, radiating authority and resolve. "Evidence?" Victor repeated, his voice sharp. "You want evidence?" He placed a thick file on the table, sliding it toward the board members. "Here's proof of discriminatory hiring practices, internal communications revealing bias, and documented cases where patient outcomes were directly impacted by race. Shall I continue?" The room erupted into murmurs as the administrators flipped through the documents, their faces pale. Officer Blake sat rigidly, his earlier confidence crumbling. "And let's not forget our friends in blue," Victor continued, turning his piercing gaze to Blake and Harris. "Thanks to recent investigations, we now have audio recordings of derogatory remarks made during traffic stops. And yes, they include references to Dr. Hayes." "Care to explain yourselves, gentlemen?" Blake stammered, sweat forming on his forehead. Harris avoided eye contact altogether, his bravado gone. Victor didn't wait for a response. Effective immediately, sweeping changes will be implemented. Discriminatory staff will be terminated. Funds previously withheld from underserved departments will be reinstated. Mandatory anti-racism training will begin next week. As for officers, Blake and Harris, they'll answer to both internal affairs and public accountability measures. The room buzzed with shock, but Victor wasn't finished. Turning to Jordan, his expression softened. Dr. Hayes, you've carried this burden alone for far too long. You deserve better, not just as a doctor, but as a human being. After the meeting adjourned, Jordan lingered behind, still processing everything that had happened. Victor approached him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I know what it feels like, Victor admitted quietly. Early in my career, I faced the same doubts, the same barriers. People told me I didn't belong, that I wasn't good enough, but I refused to let them define me. Jordan looked at him, tears welling in his eyes. Why are you doing this? Why fight so hard for someone like me? Victor smiled gently. Because everyone deserves a chance to succeed without carrying the weight of prejudice on their shoulders. Because if I can help even one person avoid the pain I endured, then it's worth it. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jordan allowed himself to believe that change was possible. Not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. Jordan stood in the hospital's main lobby, surrounded by a group of doctors, nurses, and administrators. The room buzzed with nervous energy as he prepared to speak about the sweeping reforms set to take place. With Victor's support, Jordan had been given the authority to lead these changes, and though the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him, he felt a spark of hope for the first time in years. Thank you all for being here, Jordan began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. We've reached a turning point, not just for this hospital, but for every patient who walks through our doors. For too long, systemic racism has shaped how care is delivered, often at the cost of lives. That ends now, he paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Starting today, we're implementing new policies to ensure equitable treatment for every patient, regardless of their background. We're also launching training programs to address implicit bias among staff. This isn't just about checking boxes. It's about saving lives. A young nurse raised her hand hesitantly. Dr. Hayes, what if some people resist these changes? Not everyone will agree with them. Jordan nodded, acknowledging the challenge. Change is hard, especially when it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. But staying silent isn't an option anymore. If we want to call ourselves healers, we need to start healing more than just physical wounds. That means facing the harm caused by prejudice head-on. The room grew quiet as his words resonated. For many in the crowd, it was the first time they'd heard such direct acknowledgement of the hospital's flaws. Some looked uneasy, while others seemed inspired. Jordan knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to fight for every step forward. Later that week, news broke that officers Blake and Harris had been stripped of their badges following an internal investigation. Their names were splashed across headlines alongside damning evidence of their misconduct. Public outrage mounted, fueling calls for broader accountability within law enforcement. At home, Jordan watched the news with Maya, who sat beside him holding his hand. It's not enough, she said softly, her tone thoughtful rather than bitter. But it's a start. You're right, Jordan replied, leaning back against the couch. Accountability doesn't undo the damage they've done. But maybe it sends a message that no one is above justice no matter their badge or title. The next day, Jordan visited the young girl he'd saved weeks earlier. She was sitting up in her hospital bed, sketching pictures in a notebook when he walked in, her face lit up at the sight of him. Dr. Hayes, she exclaimed, waving enthusiastically. You came back. I promised I would, Jordan said, smiling warmly as he pulled up a chair beside her bed. How are you feeling? Better, she replied, showing him her drawings. I made this one for you. She handed him a colorful picture of a superhero wearing a stethoscope standing triumphantly over a fallen car. Jordan chuckled, touched by her gesture. Wow, this is amazing. Looks like I have my work cut out for me living up to this. Her expression turned serious for a moment. You saved my life, Dr. Hayes. My mom says I wouldn't be here without you. His throat tightened as he struggled to find words. I'm glad I could help, he finally managed. But remember, heroes come in all shapes and sizes, including little girls brave enough to keep fighting, even when things get tough. As he left her room, Jordan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Saving one life wasn't enough. He wanted to save thousands, to create a world where no child had to wonder if they'd receive proper care because of the color of their skin. That evening, Victor called Jordan to meet him in his office. When Jordan arrived, Victor greeted him with a proud smile. You've done incredible work already, Victor said, gesturing for Jordan to sit. But there's something bigger I want to share. With you. Something that could change everything. Jordan frowned, intrigued. What do you mean? Victor leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with determination. I've decided to launch a national foundation aimed at dismantling systemic racism in healthcare and law enforcement, and I want you to co-lead it. For a moment, Jordan was speechless. Me? Are you sure? Absolutely, Victor replied firmly. This isn't just your fight anymore, it's ours. Together we can unite people from all walks of life to demand better. Imagine the impact we could have. Policy changes, community outreach, education initiatives. It's time to turn individual battles into collective victories. Jordan felt a surge of both excitement and fear. Could he really shoulder something so monumental? But then he thought of the girl he'd just visited, of every patient he'd ever fought for, and of the countless others still waiting for someone to stand up for them. I'm in, he said finally, his voice resolute. Let's do this. Days later, Jordan stood alongside Victor at a packed press conference. Reporters shouted questions as cameras flashed around them. Behind them stood activists, doctors, survivors, all united under the banner of change. The diversity of the group spoke. Volumes, each person representing a piece of the larger movement taking shape. Victor stepped up to the microphone first. Today marks the beginning of a journey toward true equality, he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. Systemic racism has plagued our institutions for far too long, but together we can dismantle it brick by brick. When it was Jordan's turn to speak, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Real change starts with courage, he began, his voice strong despite the nerves coursing through him. Courage to speak out, to challenge the status quo, and to believe that a better future is possible. To anyone watching, know this. Your voice matters. Your actions matter. Together, we can build a world where everyone gets the care and respect they deserve. As the event concluded, Jordan glanced at the crowd gathered behind him. Among them were faces of all ages, races, and backgrounds, each carrying their own stories of struggle and resilience. They weren't just witnesses, they were partners in the fight ahead. And as the final words appeared on screen, real change starts when we refuse to stay silent. Jordan felt a profound sense of hope. The battle was far from over, but for the first time he truly believed victory was within reach. If you found this story powerful and inspiring, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with others. Who needs to hear it? Let's spread the message of resilience, justice, and change. Comment below. How can we work together to dismantle systemic racism in our communities? Your voice matters. Like this video to show your support for stories that challenge injustice and inspire action. Subscribe for more thought-provoking content that sparks conversations about real-world issues and empowers us all to make a difference. Together we can create a movement, one story, one voice, one action at a time. Thank you for being part of the change.